First, I'd like to thank Richard Taylor and Marquette University for inviting me to be here today, at least virtually. Second, for those who know my work, you will recognize that a paper on the virtues and intellectual humility is a significant departure from my normal area of study, which is natural philosophy. Thus, a very brief explanation may be warranted. Earlier this year, I was asked to participate in a workshop at St. Louis University as part of their Philosophy and Theology of Intellectual Humility project, which is being led by John Greco and Eleanor Stump and is being funded by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. Specifically, I was asked to present on the notion of Islamic intellectual humility. While I reluctantly agreed, reluctantly precisely because this is not my area, I also did so on the condition that I limit myself primarily to what Muslim philosophers and theologians during the classical period of Islam, around 850 to 1200, had to say about these and other related topics. And indeed, classical philosophy in the Arabic world is an area in which I am a specialist. So what I present here today is the first fruits of that research. Now, I take it that one of the primary goals, if not the primary goal of philosophical investigations into culturally and historically separate ethical systems, is not to see whether those non-modern or non-Anglo-European cultures share with us some preconceived idea of the virtues, and specifically for my purposes today, humility, but rather to see how those other cultures view humility on their own terms, and whether those other cultures' views differ from our own, or at least are nuanced in distinctive ways. Now, such a goal has the potential advantage of highlighting our own preconceptions and even perhaps offers us an opportunity to show some intellectual humility when considering a culture quite separate from our own. So let me begin with two potential preconceptions that we today might unreflectively assume when considering the notion of the Islamic virtue of intellectual humility. The first assumption is that humility is in fact a virtue. Interestingly, the Arabic term for humility, tawadia, does not appear in the Quran at all. Now, this observation is not to suggest that the Quran is silent on the subject of humility. Still, if one's gut instinct is that the subject of humility should be treated in the Quran, and its absence would somehow be a flaw, one probably is doing so on the preconception that humility must be a virtue. Now, during the course of this presentation, I consider some influential thinkers who questioned whether humility is a virtue and their reasons for doing so. And all of this is to say that we today in the West readily accept that humility is a virtue. But whether in fact it is requires some account of what a virtue is and some recognition of what does and does not count as humility. A second assumption, which we might bring to the table unaware, is that there is some single unique thing, the Islamic virtue of humility. The fact is that there were many distinct accounts of humility among medieval Islamic philosophers and theologians. The diversity in part results from an attempt to synthesize elements in Greek ethical theory and the morality of the Abrahamic traditions. Now, in this regard, it is important to note that falsafa is not merely, that is to say, the sort of Neoplatonized Aristotelianism that was transmitted from the Greek world to the Arabic world. That falsafa is not merely a continuation of Hellenistic philosophy. Rather, it is a fusion of the Greek sciences and the cultures and religious influences of the Eastern Mediterranean world. While the primary religious influence was obviously Islam, one must never lose sight of the fact that Muslims did not view their religion as a new one, but as the completion and perfection of Judaism and Christianity. Thus, differences about the importance and nature of humility arise depending upon what elements, Greek, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, are emphasized in one's account of humility. Now, in order to avoid these and other potential biases, I propose first to outline the general falsafa theory about the nature of virtue. For in order to see whether humility is an instance of virtue, one must first understand how the notion of virtue is being used. As we shall see, Platonic and Aristotelian accounts of the virtues provided the general theoretical framework for medieval Arabic works on ethics. Second, I consider the various ancient Greek attitudes toward humility, which informed the attitudes of the medieval Muslim world. What we see is that a tension existed between Greek philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle, and Christian scriptures concerning the moral status of humility. Third, I take up various accounts of humility found among medieval Muslim intellectuals. I particularly focus on the views of the philosopher Avicenna and the theologian Al-Ghazali. Fourth, and finally, based upon these accounts and how they differ both from one another and even perhaps from our own conception of humility, I identify no less than two distinct dimensions at play in a theory of intellectual humility. One element concerns the intellectual content of beliefs, while the other involves individuals' various intellectual capacities. So, to the first task, the medieval Islamic philosopher's account of virtue. The Arabic word for virtue is faddala, which, like the Greek arete and even the English virtue, can signify both a moral character as well as, more generally, any excellence. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle formally defines this moral sense of virtue as, quote, and it's here on the slide, a state that chooses which is found in the mean that is relative to us as defined by reason. Now, philosophers in the medieval Islamic world understood this state in reference to how one responds to the urges and desires of one or another of three psychological faculties. These psychological faculties are the concupiscent faculty, or here the appetitive faculty, which gives rise to the desires for food, drink, sex, and other such bodily appetites. The irascible faculty, or here the spirited one, which explains the emotions of anger and fear, and so our urges for fight or flight. And finally, the rational faculty, which might further be divided into theoretical reason and practical reason, and clearly is related to the intellectual virtues. According to many Muslim philosophers, associated with one or more of these psychological faculties are the four so-called cardinal virtues: temperance, ifaq, courage, shaja'ah, wisdom, hikmah, and justice, adala. Now, temperance indicates a type of moderation with respect to the desires of the concupiscent faculty. Courage involves an intermediate response to the emotions of the irascible faculty, and wisdom concerns the activities of the rational faculty. Now, as for justice, some philosophers, more sympathetic to Plato, viewed it as a harmony and proper balance among all three faculties, while others, drawing on the Aristotelian distinction between theoretical and practical reasoning, identified the virtue of wisdom specifically with theoretical reasoning, and then justice with practical reasoning. Now, whatever the case, most Muslim philosophers were convinced that any adequate account of virtue must be embedded within one's moral psychology. Now, additionally, many ethicists in the medieval Islamic world viewed these four cardinal virtues, again, temperance, courage, wisdom, and justice, as the highest genera of virtuous activities, with various species of virtues falling under each of these cardinal virtues. Now, while there was general agreement about these four generic cardinal virtues, there was much more diversity over the list of species of virtues that fall under each of the cardinal virtues. This diversity of opinion extended not only to which character traits should be included on a list of virtues, but also under which genus a given species of virtue should fall. So as an example, consider sedateness, and that is the quality of being, for lack of a better phrase, the strong, silent type, which many of us today probably don't even recognize as a virtue. Yet, among medieval Muslims, the moral status of sedateness was something of a question. Thus, the ethicist and historian Ibn Miskawayh, whose death date is 1030, in his refinement of moral characters, places sedateness, waqar, under the virtue of temperance. El-Ghazali, in the Balance of Practice, classifies sedateness as a species of courage, whereas Avicenna does not mention sedateness at all in his Ethics. Now, as we shall see, debates of the same nature also surrounded humility. For now, I merely want to observe that Muslim ethicists had an entire system for classifying species of virtue, and that those taxonomies were not set, but subject to substantive revision. Now, before looking at Muslim accounts of humility, I first consider the attitudes of ancient Greeks towards it in order to provide an historical context. Now, no less than two almost diametrically opposed views of humility appear in the classical and Hellenistic world, that of the Christians on the one hand and of the pagan philosophers on the other. The Christian attitude toward humility was decidedly a positive one. Christian scriptures characterize humility not only as pleasing to God, but also as perhaps even typifying divinity itself, as seen in the God-man, Jesus Christ. Thus, for example, one reads at 1 Peter 5:5, I quote, "God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble," end quote. Humility in this verse clearly is presented as the virtue opposing pride, as well as being a virtue that God rewards. Indicating the arguably divine aspect of humility, Paul tells us in Philippians 2:8, quote, "He," that is to say Jesus, "humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross," end quote. Since for Christians, Jesus represents not only the exemplar of morally upstanding behavior, but also the divinity itself, Paul is exhorting us to imitate Jesus' humility precisely because it is a virtue that God exhibits. Examples from Christian scriptures revealing this attitude about the moral value of humility can be extended. Humility for Christians, then, is clearly a virtue. Now, the term for humility in all the verses just cited, and by far the preferred Greek term for humility throughout Christian scriptures, is tapanates, or some etymologically linked term. Furthermore, tapanates frequently underlies the Greek Septuagint translation of the Hebrew anavah in Jewish scriptures, which can be rendered humility or affliction. In classical Greek, tapanates literally means lowness or being lowly. Thus, Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle usually take this term and its derivatives in a morally negative sense, indicating someone who is base, mean, vile, or simply of humble origins. So, for example, Plato in The Statesman, 309a, uses this term to describe those who are not among the noble and kingly, and as such have no share in what, quote, belongs to the sphere of virtue, end quote. Similarly, in Aristotle's Rhetorics 2:6, he joins and in effect identifies the quality of tapanates with micropsychia, literally smallness of soul. So, to get a sense then of how Aristotle viewed humility, consider his extended remarks about smallness of soul in Nicomachean Ethics 3:3. Now, in that work, Aristotle makes smallness of soul the vice of deficiency that contrasts with the virtue of magnanimity, megalopsuchia, in Arabic kibr nafs, literally greatness of soul. Now, the virtue of magnanimity, claims Aristotle, is a mean between, on the one hand, elevating oneself beyond what one deserves, an excess, and, on the other hand, not elevating oneself to one's deserved level, that is, being small-souled and humbling oneself, a defect. Aristotle even goes on to claim that being small-souled and humbling oneself reflects a more vicious moral state than magnanimity's other extreme, vanity or conceit. Now, my intent here is neither to defend nor to criticize Aristotle's conception of magnanimity. I merely note that this Aristotelian virtue, seen in one light, certainly appears opposed to Christian humility as a virtue. Consequently, the Philosopha tradition, which was heir to both Greek philosophy and the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, inherited a set of views about humility that were, I think, in decided tension with one another. Okay, I now turn to the medieval Islamic world and consider first the language of humility as it occurs in Arabic. As mentioned earlier, the Greek term most commonly translated as humility in Christian scriptures is tapanites. Now, from the earliest Arabic translation of Christian scriptures, this Greek term is consistently rendered by the Arabic tawadia. Now, as with other Semitic languages, Arabic uses a root system, or typically some triliteral root provides a word's base meaning. Additional terms are then derived from this root by adding various orthographic features. Now, the root of tawadia, the waw, dod, ein, has as its base meaning to place or to set something down. Tawadia is the transitive reflexive derivation of this base root, and so literally means to bring oneself down or low. Additionally, however, the sixth form of an Arabic verb, this transitive reflexive sense of which tawadia is an instance, can imply that one does the action of the root verb to oneself for one's own good. Thus, tawadia can mean to lower oneself in a way that may benefit the individual. It is likely because of this latter good-making sense of tawadia that the Arabic translator of the Nicomachean Ethics also chose tawadia to translate Aristotle's use of metrion. Now, the Greek term metrion literally means being within proper measure, and in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics has the sense of modesty. Moreover, Aristotle introduces the virtue of modesty, metrion here, when he discusses the virtue that is opposed to the vice of pride and is associated with moderate honors. Thus, owing to this translator's choice of terms, the Christian virtue of humility came to be associated with the Aristotelian virtue of modesty, and so relieving some of the tension noted in the previous section. Now, in addition to this historical accident, Christian philosophers working within the Philosopha tradition also took steps to reconcile the Greek philosophical tradition and Christian scriptures concerning humility. So, for example, the Syrian Orthodox Christian Yahya bin Adi, who dies in 974, in his work, The Refinement of Moral Characters, has this to say about humility. Humility is to stop trying to be leader, but to display a low profile and antipathy towards aggrandizement and increasing honors. The fact is that the humble person puts to one side boasting about what is excellent in himself and bragging about his rank and money. He is on guard against arrogance and pride. Humility exists only in people of high rank, their leaders, and the virtuous and knowledgeable. Folks other than these are not being humble because, well, lowness is their place and rank, and so they're not feigning it. End quote. Now, I think that while the first part of Ibn Adi's discussion should sound familiar enough, it is the latter part that is worth noting. Here, he emphasizes that a necessary condition for humility is that one be in a position of power or superiority. If one is not in such a position, well, then presenting oneself as lowly is not an instance of humility, at least according to Ibn Adi. Now here, Ibn Adi may be thinking either of the example of Jesus Christ, or, since he is in the Falsafa tradition, perhaps Plato's nobleman or Aristotle's magnanimous man. Whatever case he has in mind, Ibn Adi certainly wants to show that humility is a virtue that is perfectly compatible with honor, nobility, and high standing, provided one is not also vainglorious. So, what about Muslim philosophers? How did they view humility? Now, there were a wide variety of attitudes among Muslim intellectuals concerning humility. While Ibn Miskawayh had nothing to say about humility in his highly influential work on ethics, the refinement of moral character, certainly many of the big names of Islamic philosophy and theology, like Al-Farabi, who dies 950, Avicenna, who dies 1037, Al-Ghazali, with a memorable death date of 1111, and Nasiruddin Tusi, who dies in 1274, all did discuss humility as a virtue. Now, sometimes the discussions were brief, merely mentioning that humility is a virtue and then providing some form of definition or description. Thus, for instance, Al-Farabi, who was a teacher and associate of the Christian philosopher Yahya ibn Adi, identifies humility in his work, The Aphorisms of the Statesman, with a moral character intermediate between being proud on the one side and being vulgar or sheepish on the other. Actually, that was a quote there. So again, the quote, a moral character intermediate between being proud on the one side and being vulgar or sheepish on the other, end quote. Now, here, Al-Farabi is methodologically following Aristotle, who characterizes virtue in terms of a mean between vices. In contrast, the great Shiite philosopher and theologian Nasiruddin Tusi defines humility in terms of a genus and species, or genus and difference. Thus, according to him, humility falls under the genus of courage and has as its difference that, quote, it assigns itself no merit over those lower in station, end quote. In other words, according to Tusi, humility is that species of courage that does not fear others thinking lower of one than one's actual merits deserve. Now, Avicenna provides a fuller account of humility, albeit his discussion is terse and needs to be unpacked. In his treatise, The Science of Ethics, Avicenna classifies humility not as a species of courage, but as a virtue that falls under the genus of wisdom. He argues for this classification by noting that humility requires discernment, and discernment belongs to the faculty of reason. And again, the cardinal virtue of wisdom is understood by reference to the faculty of reason. Avicenna then describes humility thus. Humility is to restrain one's innate knowledge endowed upon human by God concerning the feeble weak, and inferior character of someone who seeks to elevate himself above his equals and exalt himself over one of them through some particular spectacular show of excellence, whether bodily or mentally. Now, there are a number of points worth noting and developing about Avicenna's account of humility. First, Avicenna defines humility in terms of a genus and difference rather than solely in terms of a mean between two vices. So this is slightly different from Aristotle. Again, for Avicenna, humility, who defines virtues in terms of a mean. Now, again, for Avicenna, humility's genus is wisdom, while the specific difference is discernment in the form of self-knowledge. Specifically, one knows that one is better than someone else, and yet does not act upon that knowledge so as to humiliate the inferior person. So an example might be a teacher who is confronted by an overly zealous student, where the student presents an idea as if it's groundbreaking, world-changing, or the like, when the fact is the idea is not. Second, like Ibn Adi before him, Avicenna makes being superior to another, and indeed recognizing that superiority, a necessary condition for humility. Here, a brief note on Avicenna's Arabic and an aside on how his audience would have understood his meaning will make this second point much stronger. Avicenna uses the Arabic passive verb futara to be endowed, understood by God, and the etymologically linked fitra, innate character, when speaking of one's knowledge of self-superiority. Now, this term would have made it amply clear to those in Avicenna's own historic and cultural milieu that the humble person must be inherently and by nature superior to the other person. Now, on this point, let me linger. Most philosophers in the Falsafa tradition recognized a natural intellectual hierarchy among humans. This intellectual hierarchy consisted of no less than 3 grades of humans, defined by reference to what sort of proof one finds convincing. Hence my 3 folks and the various 3 different learning styles, right? Although Avicenna's learning styles are going to be very different than our modern ones. Right? The lowest class of humans, then, is that of those who find rhetorical arguments convincing with their appeal to images and emotions. Perhaps the middle child here. The next class up is those who are persuaded by dialectical arguments. That is, arguments whose premises, while highly probable, are not in fact absolutely necessary. Above the dialectical class, there is the demonstrative class, which consists of philosophers, sages, and prophets. Philosophers on this classification are defined as those who are convinced by demonstrations, where a demonstration is understood in the sense explained by Aristotle in his posterior analytics, namely, a logically valid argument that proceeds from purportedly necessary first principles. Now, Avicenna's appeal to this intellectual hierarchy in his account of humility I take to be radically opposed to what many of us today might believe about humility. For I take it that many of us are predisposed towards some form of egalitarianism, at least in the West. While one might know more than another, this superiority is often viewed as being due to one's efforts or nurture, not because one is inherently and by nature intellectually better than others. Whatever one might think about this Avicennan condition on intellectual humility, it represents an important point in his account. A third aspect of Avicenna's conception of humility is that it requires a response to another. This point, in fact, can be generalized, since important medieval Muslim ethicists like Ibn Miskawayh argue that all virtues require interactions with others. Thus, the hermit who lives in isolation from society, or the scholar who stays locked up in his or her study, cannot be virtuous. They are at best merely amoral. Now, Avicennan humility is specifically a response to a vice in another. Namely, it is how one treats someone who is acting either arrogantly or who has wrongly assessed his or her own merit. In this latter case, an intellectual vice, if you will, being a lack of discernment. In either case, the humble person is responding to someone who has made a mistake in discernment, namely someone who thinks either too highly of him or herself or not highly enough. In short, for Avicenna, humility essentially involves a certain social dimension. It is always a response to another human. Now, I say more about intellectual humility in Avicenna when I compare him with Al-Ghazali, but for now, just let me make two brief observations. First, intellectual humility for Avicenna demands a fair self-assessment of one's intellectual abilities. Such a self-assessment must not only avoid ascribing a greater status to one's intellectual ability than one merits, but also not underestimating one's abilities. For in this latter case, namely under-evaluating one's abilities, one may in fact endorse or encourage someone else's bad ideas, rather than patiently listening and then helping that other person develop and improve his or her idea. Second, Avicennan intellectual humility is not a factor in one's own acquisition of knowledge. It is not a factor. Rather, it plays a role only in how one responds to another who lacks the same degree of knowledge as oneself. Such a position is not to deny that the intellectually humble person should learn from others who are one's intellectual superiority. Still, Avicenna would classify such an attitude not as intellectual humility. So, learning from others doesn't belong to intellectual humility as such, but rather, and more likely, he would classify it as a type of intellectual modesty, namely the fear of holding a wrong or inferior set of beliefs. Now, again, I say more about Avicenna and intellectual humility when I compare his account with that of Al-Ghazali, to whom I now turn. Al-Ghazali discusses the virtues in a number of works. Of those, his treatise Balance of Practice is the closest to a straightforward work on ethics. While in that text, humility is not explicitly listed as a virtue, Al-Ghazali does intimately and explicitly associate humility with the virtue of sedateness, which for Ghazali is a species of courage. Now, in that discussion, Ghazali suggests that humility is of two kinds. One, blameworthy or vicious, the other, commendable or virtuous. Thus, in order to contextualize Al-Ghazali's conception of humility, I first consider his account of courage, of which humility is a species, and then his distinction between vicious and virtuous humility. Courage in Al-Ghazali is an Islamic twist on Aristotle's account of courage, Andreas in the Greek and Shaja in the Arabic. Particularly as that account is found in Nicomachean Ethics 3:6. Now, there Aristotle observes that courage is concerned with how one responds to fear, and not just any fear, but what is most frightening. Aristotle then identifies the most frightening thing with death. For he argues, and I quote, "There seems to be nothing good or bad for the dead." End quote. He then adds that the circumstances in which one stands up to one's fears must also be taken into account. For it's not how one faces any death, maintains Aristotle, but how one faces one's fear of death in war that most fittingly is courage. Now, Al-Ghazali agrees with Aristotle that courage, now this is Al-Ghazali, he agrees with Aristotle that courage is a response to what is fearful. However, he disagrees with Aristotle that the most frightening thing is death. Instead, contends Al-Ghazali, the most frightening thing is God and the possibility of eternal damnation and separation from God in the afterlife. Thus, courage involves a response to an awful and fearful God, and a realization that any other fears pale by comparison. Similarly, Al-Ghazali agrees with Aristotle that courage is most fittingly displayed in war. However, he again modifies this Aristotelian claim in light of Islamic doctrine. For Al-Ghazali understands war as jihad, that is, holy war, which has as its base meaning to strive. Drawing upon a prophetic tradition, Al-Ghazali further distinguishes between a greater striving, or jihad, al-jihad al-akbar, and a lesser striving, or jihad, al-jihad al-asghar. The lesser jihad is a Muslim's armed conflict or battle with unbelievers so as to spread Islam. That's the lesser jihad. Whereas the greater jihad, according to Al-Ghazali, is one's striving or warring against one's bodily passions in order to draw closer to God. In this vein, Al-Ghazali even goes so far as to deny the traditional Muslim view that martyrs hold the most exalted positions in heaven. In their stead, Al-Ghazali rather places the learned men, the ulama, who have won the battle against their bodily desires, so as to put a desire for God, for knowing God, above all else. Now, the primary sense of courage for Al-Ghazali then is, and I'm quoting, the soul's resistance to blameworthy fear and aspiration for the sake of the word of God Most High, end quote. As for humility, Al-Ghazali initially introduces it as a vice associated with one of the species of courage, namely sedateness. We've seen this, waqar. For he tells us sedateness, this sort of being the calm, silent type, is a mean between the vices of arrogance and humility, tawadia. Now, in that same discussion, however, Al-Ghazali also identifies a commendable sense of humility. Now, in order to distinguish the commendable from the vicious sense of humility, I want you to consider the following two scenarios. In one, an individual is constantly putting himself down and engaging in self-deprecation, and doing so in a public way. Saying, for instance, "I'm just so stupid, I'm not worthy," and the list goes on. Now, such a person may really, but incorrectly, believe these things about himself, in which case he or she is guilty of not being self-honest. Or he or she may be acting so as to provoke a response from us. "Oh, no, you really are all that smart." Or perhaps the person just wants us to believe that he's humble and so is a virtuous person. Now, it is this external and vocal show of humility, regardless of the motivation, which seems to be Al-Ghazali's vicious sense of humility. Now, alternatively, one's evaluation of one's merit may be entirely internal and not open for public consumption. In this case, one attempts to assess one's position accurately vis-a-vis the various contexts of one's life. Ultimately, for al-Ghazali, such examination leads to an appreciation of our place in the cosmos and our status relative to God. Now, of course, compared with God, we are lowly, and there simply is no room on our part for arrogance, al-Ghazali tells us. In his short religious manual, The Beginning of Guidance, al-Ghazali explains how such a reflection on our position relative to God should purge us of arrogance, both toward God and towards those around us. He advises Muslims thus. This is going to be a long quote, but I think it really does get at the heart of Ghazalian humility. Your belief that you are better than others is sheer ignorance. Rather, you ought not to look at anyone without considering that he is better than you and superior to you. Thus, if you see a child, say, "This person has never sinned against God, but I have sinned, and so he is better than I." If you see an older person, say, "This man was a servant of God before me, and is certainly better than I." If he is a scholar, say, "This man has been given what I have not been given, and reached what I did not reach, and knows what I am ignorant of. Then how shall I be like him?" If he is ignorant, say, "This man has sinned against God in ignorance, while I have sinned against him knowingly. So God's case against me is stronger, and I don't know what end he will give to me and what end to him." If the man you meet is an unbeliever, say, "I don't know, perhaps he will become a Muslim, and his life will end in doing good, and because of his acceptance of Islam, something of his sins will be taken away, as a hair is taken from dough. As for me, God is our refuge. God grant it doesn't happen. But perhaps God will lead me astray so that I become an unbeliever, and my life ends in doing evil. And then tomorrow he, that is to say the unbeliever, will be among those brought near to God, and I shall be among the damned." End quote. And while al-Ghazali does not explicitly mention the term humility in the above passage, humility, I think, clearly is the virtue that he wants us to foster, at least the commendable sense mentioned above. Indeed, in his magnum opus, The Revivification of the Religious Sciences, al-Ghazali finally identifies humility as, quote, "the chief moral character." Now, to sum up al-Ghazali's thought on humility, humility is a type of courage which essentially involves self-reflection about one's relation to a fearful God and then to others in light of that relation. All right, so let's do a quick comparison of al-Ghazali and Avicenna's views of humility, which will provide the context for further thoughts on intellectual humility. I see, first, both thinkers make self-examination essential to humility. To be humble, one must have a true and accurate appraisal of one's place and status vis-a-vis others. Consequently, on their views, while one may perform acts that appear humble on the outside, if there is not an honest reflection on one's own status, and then acting in light of that reflection, those acts would be only accidentally humble ones. Now, accidental humility might be comparable to getting a good score on an exam on which one simply guessed at every question. In this case, one is neither intellectually better off for the high score or the humble acts, nor in a position to help others in the way the truly humble person is. Second, while both men make humility a response to something external, they do so in radically different ways. For Avicenna, humility involves one's response to those inferior to oneself. In contrast, for Ghazali, humility involves a response to one who is infinitely superior, namely to God. Alternatively, one might say that for Ghazali, intellectual humility involves a response to the truth. And indeed, the truth, el-Haq, is one of the 99 beautiful names for God in Islam. Now, taken in this way, al-Ghazali's theory of intellectual humility requires that one be committed to something called the truth, and that we humans have access to that truth. A third point of comparison, which follows upon this last one, is that for both al-Ghazali and Avicenna, there are sets of beliefs that an intellectually humble person simply should never give up. In the case of Avicenna, these beliefs are the conclusions of demonstrations, while in the case of al-Ghazali, it is the revealed word of God, or the truth. Now, I mention this last point since today we might think that intellectual humility requires a fallibilist attitude. We should, in principle, be willing to revise or set down any one of our beliefs in light of new evidence. Indeed, most of us today, I suspect, and I include myself here, are leery about the prospect of ever attaining a demonstration in the strong sense that Avicenna endorses. It is more difficult, however, to reject this condition, if we should, on Ghazali's formulation, with its tenacity of conviction to the Word of God or to the truth. For if humility is a sort of courage, as al-Ghazali believes, then intellectual humility may well involve holding to some set of beliefs, even in the face of strong contravening evidence. So let me conclude by summing up what I consider to be two of the more salient and important elements for understanding intellectual humility that we can draw on from our medieval Muslim predecessors. So I figure even today, if we're trying to understand what intellectual humility is, there's at least 2 points that these folks have observed that we should probably take into account. These points concern the variable dimensions of a theory of intellectual humility. One dimension concerns the intellectual humble person's status with respect to others, while the second involves the intellectually humble person's attitudes towards his or her own set of beliefs. Concerning the humble person's status with respect to others, the unquestionable assumption among Muslim ethicists is that humility, and perhaps the virtues more generally, is always a response to another. There simply are no humble solipsists. The other individual, however, might refer to something greater than ourselves, as in al-Ghazali's theory, or to humans, as in Avicenna's account. Obviously, if the response is to something greater than ourselves, then a recognition of one's low status is essential to humility. In contrast, if the response is to other humans, then it seems an open question whether the humble person must essentially view him or herself as lower, equal, or even perhaps superior. Thus, I leave this point as one that an adequate theory of intellectual humility should address. Second, the second dimension concerns beliefs. It seems that any theory of intellectual humility in some way must involve how one responds to beliefs. This response may involve how one acquires beliefs, or how one responds to the beliefs of others, and even what attitude to take towards one's own beliefs. Now, concerning how we should respond to our own beliefs, Both our Muslim predecessors and we today can agree that the intellectually humble person should be willing to set aside pride, misinformation, ignorance, and the like. The humble individual should revise at least some of, even perhaps most of, his beliefs in the light of strong contravening evidence. The issue then is a demarcation one. First, are there certain beliefs that an intellectually humble person should simply never give up? Or should all beliefs be subject to revision? Second, if there are some inseparable beliefs, which ones are they? Do they have certain hallmarks, or is it their place and function in one's larger belief system that makes them inalienable? Now, I do not pretend to have answers to these questions, but they do seem to be the sort of issues that an adequate theory of intellectual humility should address. And with that, I humbly conclude. Thank you all very much. I'm looking forward to the question and answer time. Cheers. Bye-bye.